I grew up with the gentle Jesus, meek and mild image of Jesus. And even the Christmas carols talked about a baby that didn't even cry. No crying he made when the cows bellowed. That cool and calm Jesus who seemed to waft through things so easily and had an answer for everyone. But then you come across this story when Jesus comes to town and he does some shouting and some pushing and some shoving and causes quite a scene. What's happening here that has caused Jesus to lose his meek and mild and to let rip with a loud voice and a plaited whip? Through the season of Lent, we follow Jesus' journey to Jerusalem and to the cross. It must have been an incredibly difficult time for Jesus. Every step he took along the way would have been agonising, knowing what was awaiting him. It's interesting that in John's Gospel, this passage comes in the second chapter, right wedged in between the wedding in Cana and the visit of Nicodemus. In the earlier written Gospels, this happens at the end of Jesus' ministry, at the time he was going to the cross. And it makes me think that maybe John wasn't quite so concerned about keeping strict chronological order. At the time of the Passover, Jerusalem was absolutely teeming with people from all over the known world. Visitors came to celebrate the Passover, the time when they remembered God redeeming his people, bringing them out of captivity in Egypt, out from under the oppression of the Pharaoh, and then eventually into the Promised Land. Jesus would have had much on his mind, terrible weight of what was coming in the days ahead. But it's interesting that he went out of his way, despite that, to cause quite a big scene in the temple. Some would suggest that it was an impulsive temper tantrum. We might think that maybe Jesus was letting out some of his anxiety and frustration, or maybe it was some ill-thought-out storming of the Capitol building. But we know that Jesus thought this through well. He even took the time to weave a whip. Jesus had it all planned. He was in full control of himself as he set about turning tables and chasing people and animals. I can't even begin to imagine the scene. The temple would have been teeming with people, the court of the Gentiles packed out with animals and birds, which for some Jewish people would seem appropriate. The noise would be deafening and the smell terrible. Can you imagine coming to church and having a sale yard set up in the foyer here, full of cattle and sheep and money changers, and having to wade through animal manure, walk it into the sanctuary, and then not be able to hear anything in the way of worship for all the bellowing and mooing and baaing and shouting? That's the scene. Money changers were taking advantages from other people who had from people from other places who had different currencies and shortchanging them. They were cheats who paid a big commission to the priests who should have been there to serve God, not themselves. So it's little wonder that Jesus calls his Father's house a den of thieves. And Jesus took a stand, and I'm really glad that he did. Jesus kicked butt. Can I say that in church? Yes. There's no meek and mild here, but a man with a passion for his Father's house who was a fierce opponent of those who exercised injustice and who used religion to feed their own selfish greed. So how do we relate to this account in the second chapter of John? I wonder whether too often we fit into that meek and mild category. We can feel powerless, or even worse, We can accept the injustice around us because we're caught up in the cycle of greed and care more about our own comfort than the needs of others. What are the things that we can shout out against? Where are the tables that we can put our shoulder to and overturn? Tomorrow is International Women's Day. Do we get angry about the things that have been reported lately that have happened to young girls and women? To hear that there can be people assaulted in our federal parliament buildings? Are we stirred up by the plight of women and children who have been caught up in the worldwide sex trafficking business? Are we angry when we hear about people starving in Ethiopia because of warring factions, greed and hatred, and the world doesn't seem to care? Are we upset when we know that young people can easily access the most vile pornography at any time easily on their mobile devices? And then we wonder why they act as they do. Do we seethe when we know that there are people in devastated economies in our world because of COVID who are missing out on the vaccine because the wealthy countries want it all to themselves? I could go on all day and depress you all. Are we happy to let the world go by and ignore the injustices around us because we really don't care, or we're too meek and mild and no crying we make? Let's follow Jesus on his road to the cross, and let's make some noise and tip some tables and scatter some cash, even if it means having to carry a cross.
For the message of the cross is foolishness for those who are perishing, and to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And if we move into the next paragraph in Corinthians there, chapter 1, it says, in the verse that I refer to, I use the word confound in preference to the word shame. Confound means to render speechless, perplex, or discomfort. But God chose the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to confound the strong. Bit odd, given our current sensibilities, where we are constantly reminded that money, power and pleasure, and more recently, care and promotion of the self, are the stuff of greatness. But as we contemplate over Easter the appalling, humiliating death by crucifixion, which was reserved by the Romans for the most contemptible of criminals, we must become aware of the irony, indeed the paradox, that the cross is the last place where humanity could expect to discover God's ultimate wisdom and power. To the onlooker, this is all very baffling. A crucifixion is not a place to win friends and influence people. There is no denying, however, that this Jesus of humble beginnings and such excruciating execution has become probably the most significant person in world history. Yale historian Yaroslav Pelikan captured well the impact Jesus has had on the world, and he wrote this: "Regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth, this man left to die in the most vulnerable of places, has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 20 centuries. We know more about Jesus than we know about many ancient historical figures, a remarkable fact given the modesty of his upbringing and the humility of his death. Jesus did not grow up in one of the great cities of the ancient world like Rome or even Jerusalem, but lived in a small Galilean village called Nazareth. Historian Philip Schaff described the overwhelming influence which Jesus had on the subsequent history and cultures of the world. This Jesus of Nazareth, without money and arms, conquered more millions than Alexander, Caesar, Muhammad and Napoleon. Without science, he shed more light on things human and divine than all philosophers and scholars combined. Without the eloquence of schools, he spoke such words of life that were never spoken before or since, and produced effects which lie beyond the reach of orator or poet. Without writing a single line, he set more pens in motion. I love that, more pens in motion. And furnished themes for more sermons, orations, discussions, learned volumes, works of art, songs of praise, and more than the whole army of great men and of ancient and modern times, and I might add, great women. He is permanently world famous. He launched an equality revolution in his declaration that in the eyes of his Father, our God, all people are equal. This equality revolution, and it was that, paved the way for democracy. His universal concern for those who suffered and those who did not belong to elites transcended the rules of the ancient world. And believe me, the rules of the ancient world were barbaric and very stratified and elitist. His compassion for the poor led to the beginnings of modern-day hospitals, hospices and charities. The notion that every child bore the image of God helped fuel the move for universal literacy. Jesus' life as a foot-washing servant, would eventually lead to the adoption of humility as a widely admired virtue. Human rights movements often have deeply Christian roots. All this, and we haven't mentioned the life-transforming power of forgiveness taught by Jesus, forgiveness between each other and between us and our God. Everyone in this room has benefited profoundly from these wonderful changes that Jesus wrought. But, and there's a big but, for so many who have chosen to follow the foolish ways, and incidentally, I believe the Greek word foolish in the script in the Bible means moronic. So for all those who follow this moronic teachers of Jesus, there can be a profound cost. This is where my personal response to the call to follow the foolishness of God, the moronicness of God, the path of being a known believer in an increasingly sceptical, even antagonistic Western society becomes a challenge. Most people cannot deny the advances that humanity has made as a result of Jesus' teaching. But no one can deny the failures of the church to follow the path of love. I find that dichotomy a challenge. And I have sat and listened to conversations that included damning comments about the failings and often the crimes of the church, for which there is no defence, and be in some anguish as to how and when I can raise the issue of the love of God and mention the name of Jesus. I am in awe of people in other countries who choose to claim Jesus, this foolish man who died on a cross, as their Saviour and Lord, and as a result suffer terribly, steadfastly refusing to deny him. Often, in that case, losing nationality, home, spouse, livelihood, freedom, and ultimately their lives at the hands of those whose hatred of the Christian God and his followers knows no limit. Many suffer such oppression today, but none more so than the followers of Jesus. Christians bear the brunt, I'm told, of some 80% of religious discrimination. In the Middle East homeland of the church is under threat of extinction, and I hope we're all noting the current visit of the Pope to Mosul, which is in Mesopotamia, which I'm told again is the birthplace of Christianity, and the church there has been diminished to almost nothing. In Australia, when we declare our faith in Jesus, we risk scorn, a few insults about our intellect and our inability to face reality. There being also in Australia a growing antagonism towards Christianity. This is where the challenge lies for me, and I suspect for us all. I often wonder if my faith or the faith of the church in the West could withstand increased active antipathy from the powerful currents of secularism that seek to silence the voice of Christianity in our culture. This is the challenge I take from these verses. Could I withstand such loss? Could I give up my comfort and social status to be faithful, to be following this foolishness? This is a test for all believers. A question Rod Dreher asks in his book, The Benedict Option, is this: will they, that is the Christians, you and me, be willing to sacrifice what they believe for the sake of saving social status or economic viability? Some songs we sing ask us to declare, I surrender all. I sometimes whisper those words, asking God to give me strength should such an occasion arise. As John Ortberg, a minister in the United States, writes in the Huffington Post, and I must honour him because I have drawn heavily from his article, this cross of Jesus, this foolish cross of Jesus remains at one and the same time offensive idiocy and divine delight. And Paul's teaching, and I might add, living, never downplays, disguises or dismisses the power and wisdom of God. Does ours. Paul says, I identified myself completely with him. Indeed, I have been crucified with Christ. My ego is no longer central. It is no longer important that I appear righteous before you or have your good opinion, and I am no longer driven to impress God. Christ lives in me. The life you see me living is not mine, but it is lived by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I am not going to go back on that. Amen.